Blog Talk Radio.
Is racism hurting you? On issues of race, are you unable to speak, think, and act with clarity and confidence? Are you tired of laughing when nothing is funny, smiling when you are not happy, agreeing when you really disagree? At counterracism.com, you can learn specific strategies and techniques to counter the behaviors of the people who practice racism in all areas of activity, using words correctly, following counter-racist logic, even counter-racist science projects designed to reveal what racism is, how it works, and how to counter it. The open-source code writing format allows you to pick and choose from a variety of counter-racist suggestions so you can produce the code that works for you. Stop by counterracism.com today and help replace racism with justice.
That's counter-racism.com.
Our people are very serious about not being very serious. Meanwhile, white people are very serious about playing hardball against us. And this hardball is called genocide.
Context of White Supremacy, Gus T Renegade, and Justice, in for another program to share constructive information on racism, white supremacy, what it is, and how it works. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into the broadcast. Hope you're not wasting your time. As I've said consistently, if you do not feel like you are getting information that will help improve your quality of life, aid you in solving problems, please do not waste your time on this program. They have thousands of real programs at Blog Talk Radio alone. You can start your own program, website, film, book, anything. We do not need black people, victims of racism, white supremacy, wasting time. With that said, if you do find the broadcast constructive, please invest. We are fundraising for the entire month of January, broadcasting every day. You can invest. My PayPal link is right below the description for every program. Also, books. That is also super helpful. We have a wish list at Amazon.com under Gus T Renegade. It's been updated, so any of the books on there, feel free. That would be super helpful. And I'm trying to turn those into programs to see if the books that I have there, if I can get the authors to come chat with us. So, yeah, that's another way that you can definitely invest. And again, posting links for the website, for the program, really, really helpful. Put it on Twitter, Facebook, any other websites. If you have your own website, if you can post a link, put the player up, it's super helpful. It drives traffic to the site. And if you think this program has constructive information that will dislodge some of the confusion that non-white people are laboring under, please share. Thank you. That said, we are going to hop into the program. The person who will be visiting with us today, his efforts to replace white supremacy with justice had a big impact on clearing up a lot of the confusion that I had about what was taking place on the planet. Was a great reservoir of just information. As I shared on the broadcast yesterday, it took me a long time to get my hands on a copy of Mr. Fuller's book, which also was purchased from our guest's website. But it took me a long time to get a copy of the book. But in the meantime, I was able to listen to a lot of Mr. Fuller's lectures, as well as Dr. Welsing, which just was invaluable resource for me to understand racism, white supremacy, and get familiar with counter-racist logic. I used to listen to counter-racism. You already heard the commercial. I used to listen to it pretty endlessly before this program started in the fall of 2007. And actually, when he started the program, he was one of the first folks to contact myself and Back of the Bus in support. He was a guest on the program way back when, and he started putting the program in the counter-racism rotation pretty immediately. I think some of the folks who are listening to the program now, a handful of them, they remember the program from playing on his network. So it's a real treat to have him on the program. He just finished his first book, I believe, on racism, white supremacy. It is titled How to Support and Defend the United States Constitution for Victims of Racism, White Supremacy. It is available in the description. If you click that link, you can download the book, and I think it's super helpful. Hopefully, listening to this program, you will be encouraged to check it out and use it to establish justice as soon as possible. The website again for counter-racism, counter-racism.com. You can check out the Counter-Racism Radio Network, Counter-Racism Television. They have counter-racist film reviews. They have the work study forum where you can post and get suggestions, read past posts. Like I said, just excellent source of information for victims of racism, white supremacy. Our guest, Mr. Edward L. Williams, Jr. Mr. Williams, are you with us, sir?
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Appreciate you giving up a bit of your Friday evening. I'm sure you could have been doing a lot of other things with your time. For folks who have not visited the website, counter-racism.com, could you give them a little bit more information just about who you are and whatever you think it would be important for folks listening in to know?
Well, you did a pretty good job covering the website. I'll attempt to add a little bit more information. I'm a non-white person who has struggled for many years to try to figure out what was going on around me. How do things work? Come up in a huge family. I have 9 sisters who are older than me and a brother who's younger than me. And like many families of non-white people back in those days, and unfortunately still today, there were many things that were not discussed. Parents with their children. I remember being told, for example, never to use the word nigger ever. So matters of race being discussed with the children was completely out of the question. Raised a Christian, had many questions in reference to the ideology and things of that nature as I went through life attempting to find out the purpose for me being here. What is the reason of life? What's the reason of existence? What is the reason for my existence? And went through lots of phases, lots of different phases, while I struggled to find that information. Talked with a lot of people, joined a lot of different kinds of religions, different names or types of religions, and always seemed to have come up short in terms of finding the answers that was needed. in order to provide me focus of what I'm supposed to be doing while I'm here. And talked to lots of people as I got older. Came across a copy of Dr. Welsing's book, The ISIS Papers. It was back in the early 90s, early to mid-90s. And I read that book. And a lot of the ideas in that book were similar to a lot of the conclusions I had already drawn. And I thought it was interesting, very interesting. Reading that book, among all the other books that I've read during my, what I call my Afrocentric phase, I literally read hundreds of books. That book struck me as odd. It was slightly different. Things in it were slightly different. I noted that she mentioned Mr. Neely Fuller Jr. in her book. I didn't really take an account of who that was at the time. And during this period, the Internet was becoming of age, so to speak, especially among black people, non-white people. And been a lot of talking to a lot of people online about a lot of different things. And as I began to discover words as tools, the use of language, and how to use it in a constructive manner, I noticed that I began to get a lot of flack from people who said that they were white about the way that I use words. And so I said, well, hey, wait a minute, I must be on to something. There's something about this. And so I began to dig deeper, observing the things as they happen around the globe and understanding. It was really an understanding in its infancy stage of how to think on a global scale and how to use words on a global scale. I stopped using the word black and began to use the word non-white, which for me helped me to think on a global scale, not just think about what's going on around the corner at the liquor store. And there were many words, hundreds of words, that I began to use in a different manner, began to redefine in a different manner. And as I began to use these words, I began to think differently. And because of that, I began to act differently. I found the Code.net website, John Bilal's website, and there's a handful of people who began to post on that website and had some very, very interesting conversations until the time where I thought it was time for me to start my own, which was around 2003. I think that was the same year, as a matter of fact, I first began talking to Mr. Fuller and also attending the Welsing Institute lectures. So as I began to develop the skills that are required to produce what we call justice at that time, which was balance between people. Things really started to move at a rapid pace, not only in my mind, but around me in terms of how I understood what I was looking at. The website was just part of that. My conversations with people on a global scale, which the internet has helped to provide. I began selling the code book of Mr. Fuller, of which I've sold many outside of the United States. There are many people in different parts of the world who are interested and involved in producing a system of justice. Many who hunger for the information, for the use of language that's necessary to perform such a task. I began to learn faster and faster, even among the people who had known Mr. Fuller, some of which twice as long as I have. I began writing at that point and have finished several books, the first of which I've released here recently, the one that you provided in the announcement, How to Support and Defend the United States Constitution for Victims of Racism, White Supremacy. I did not know that you were an avid listener of the Counter-Racism Radio Network. I did not know that. I'm glad that that has provided you with some constructive information, and I hope that it has provided other people with constructive information as well. I'm not sure that I have found the reason that I'm supposed to be here, the reason that I am here, and what I'm supposed to be doing. But I am certain that producing a system of justice is one of those things.
Context of white supremacy. I believe Back of the Bus and myself spent quite a few hours tuning into Counter-Racism Radio. Myself and some of the other folks, we have memorized the counter-racism commercial. At any rate, before we hop into the book and some of the other information about your efforts to establish justice as soon as possible, this program, I have unfortunately concluded that we are in a global system of racism, white supremacy. I use those two terms as synonyms, same definition for both terms. That definition is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white. Do you believe that such a system exists, and do you think that definition is accurate?
Oh, definitely. I definitely believe that the system of racism, white supremacy exists, and that definition will definitely allow non-white people, if they take the time and energy to do so, to understand what it is that they're looking at when they observe how people move amongst each other on this planet.
I know Mr. Williams pays a lot of attention to words. I was very curious. I thought he might find a flaw with the wording there. Thought that would be interesting. I know you, I'm certain, have crafted your own definition of racism, white supremacy. Would you like to share your definition with listeners?
Sure. As a matter of fact, I use the definition that's in the code book. But in short, I merely say that it's the mistreatment of people on the basis of color worldwide. And for all intents and purposes, that suffices in most conversations. The whole objective, of course, for using a word is to provide understanding and clarity to the person or people who you are attempting to convey your ideas. Of course, the white people who practice racism, white supremacy, are not interested in providing clarity for the people that they classify as non-white. They use words in an effort to confuse the people that they classify as non-white, to keep them off balance, to keep them always coming to white people for the definitions of words that they are using.
Does counter-racist science, how does it change that process with regards to words, defining words, so that non-white people are not always chasing suspect racists to get clarity about a term that the suspected racists have formed themselves?
Well, counter-racist science basically is as I've written it out in the book that I wrote, two different aspects of it, but even those two different aspects it's almost impossible to separate them. Those of which are trial and error and the use of the scientific method is virtually impossible to keep them separated. Even when a person is using the scientific method for experimentation, that person is also at the same time using trial and error. There's no way to get away from it. The goal objective of that portion of the book, the second chapter of the book, Counter-Racism Science, is to enforce and emphasize the idea that a person should think their way through whatever it is that they're doing and think in detail and in depth about what it is that they're saying and what it is that they're doing, and test it repeatedly. That chapter of the book also talks about doing your own work. That's the difference that is made between trial and error and the scientific method. Standing on your own 2 feet and working against the racist white supremacists on your own. Standing by your work. There's a strong emphasis on that as well. So the use of the scientific method in reference to counter-racism science not only gives the individual insight into how to think through in a logical manner, testing what they believe to be true to see if it is true, but at the same time the individual is doing that, a couple of other things are happening. That person is learning to think scientifically. And also, that person, while they're using the scientific method, coming up with strategies and techniques that work against the system of racism, white supremacy, all of the thought, all the speech, and all the action of that individual is geared towards producing a system of justice.
Before I check with Justice to see if she has questions, I just wanted you, I think the reason non-white people, victims of racism, white supremacy, the reason that you want to be scientific about racism, white supremacy, so that you understand the logic behind what you are saying and doing to work against racist man and racist woman, so that you do not have to always feel like you got to run and call Mr. Fuller or see if you can track down Dr. Welsing to figure out what to do next. You talk about that in your book. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit, Mr. Williams?
Sure. I didn't have the resources at the time when I started experimenting with counter-racism science using the scientific method. No one else that I knew of was doing that. Mr. Fuller would talk about trial and error, but as a non-white person, I mean, and as I talk about it in the book, that was really easy for me to do. Trial and error is, I just keep running back and forth to whoever it is that I think has solutions without doing any real thinking for myself. And for many non-white people, that'll work. I mean, that is enough. That will suffice. But I began to notice something in myself. And one thing about the process of producing justice, if you lie to yourself at any time, you are shooting yourself in the foot. And so it became very difficult for me a lot of times to tell myself the truth about how it is that I was, and in some regard, how it is that I still am. But I became comfortable with being uncomfortable because I had to do it so many times and still have to. And so I noticed that by using trial and error, that if it didn't work, if what I was told didn't work, then I didn't have to do anything except blame the person that gave me the information. And so that's an easy process. But I noticed that it was making me lazier and lazier, especially in terms of thinking. I began to run experiments on the job and in different places. And I remember thinking at one time, why are all these people asking me about the way that I feel instead of asking me about what it is that I think? And it came to me. It's because I really wasn't doing a whole lot of thinking to begin with. So as I began to run counter-racism science experiments, I mentioned one in the book where I started out. I believe the first one that I ran was asking people, are you white? That's how it started out, but I've quickly modified that to ask the question, are you a white person? Then I would record the answers from people that I would ask all over the world. I began to notice that a lot of those answers were the same, even when it was highly probable that these people didn't know each other. And while studying the data and analyzing the data, just me and the Creator, no one else, because I didn't have the resources to talk to anyone else who was actually involved in that at the time, it came to me that this entire system is scientifically put together. There are certain things that a white person says and doesn't say, certain things that they'll do or not do, and the manner in which it is done or said, in order to get non-white people to respond a certain way. And that's how the system is held together. And that was a glaring, discovery for me. It's nothing like having to do your own thinking, and it's just you and the Creator and nobody else. There's something to that. And so while I dare not push that idea on other non-white people, not that they can't do it. I mean, of course they can do it. If I can do it, anybody can do it. But because many non-white people are not ready for that. And I discussed this years later with Mr. Fuller, and he said to me, he responded to me by saying, now you know why in the code book there are only suggestions. And I thought about that. And he's absolutely correct. I mean, many times you're not going to be able to teach everybody or show everybody the process by which information is obtained in order to get them to do certain things. You have to involve them in a process that, without their conscious knowledge, gives you the desired result. And I found that that's the reason that there are only suggestions in the code book. But it's all very interesting in terms of how the world works and how people look at people interactions. I mean, once you go down the path of producing justice using United Independent Method, using the words and the actions that are logically required to do so, you begin to change. You begin to change the way that you think, change the things that you say, change the things that you do. And because of that, your worldview changes. Hope I've answered your question.
Absolutely. The website again, counter-racism.com. The new book, How to Support and Defend the United States Constitution for Victims of Racism, White Supremacy. Get comfortable being uncomfortable. Justice, I believe she is here, and she should have some questions for you, Mr. Williams. Justice, your line should be open. Please proceed.
Hello, Mr. William. Welcome to the Cows.
Thank you, Justice. How can I help you?
What makes racism so important as a problem?
Well, it's difficult to solve any other, any other major problem between people without solving that problem. I mean, the closer that you get to solving any major problem among people, that problem is going to come up. And so you have to have things to say and things to do to not only solve any major problem among people, but you also have to do it in a way that you're going down the path of producing a system of justice at the same time. That's what's meant in the book by solving problems without producing more problems.
When is racism practiced?
It's practiced all the time, unfortunately. There are people who are diligent, burning midnight oil, so to speak. That's an old person's term. You might not recognize that term. Burning midnight oil, putting together strategies, techniques about how to go about keeping non-white people subject to them. And so it is a machine that is running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
How does racism, white supremacy, harm non-white people directly and indirectly?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure we have enough time to go into all the ways. The system of racism, white supremacy, at a very basic level, keeps non-white people from maturing. By that I mean it keeps non-white people from becoming exactly what it is that they were meant to become. I spoke at length during my self-introduction about all my life attempting to understand the reason that I'm here. And because the system of racism, white supremacy is in place, I may never understand that. Now also, because the system of racism, white supremacy is in place, I also have to consider that that's the reason I'm here.
You talked about counter-racism science. Can you briefly summarize in steps a counter-racism science you've run?
I'm sorry, what was the last word?
You talked about counter-racism science. Can you briefly summarize in steps a counter-racism science you've run?
Oh, sure. I mentioned one earlier where in my effort to, and there's only two basic ways that I use counter-racism science. Number one is how to figure out how the system of racism, white supremacy works. That's number one. Number two is in an effort to figure out what is required to replace the system of racism, white supremacy with a system of justice. So in my effort to kind of figure out how the system works, the counter-racism science experiment that I initially ran, the first one that I ever ran, was to ask people, are you a white person? And to record the responses, because basically I don't know what a white person is. You know, that's me not lying to myself. I can come up with a definition. There's a definition of the code book that talks about, in a logical manner, what a white person is. But in order to know what a white person is, you pretty much got to be a white person. And so there are these designations: white, non-white, and many others that the racist white supremacists are including, many of them, and eventually it'll run into the hundreds. Those two categories, the racial category and the sexual category, I mean, they are really ramping those up with many, many different classifications. And so I said, well, the logical place to start, since this is a system of white supremacy, is to figure out what is a white person. And so I had several questions lined up to ask in that one experiment. The first question, of course, is, are you a white person? And so I would ask that question, whatever answer I got, and I'll tell you, I got some pretty frustrated and angered people in response to that question. I mean, things that they said to me, I would never repeat some of those things, you know. So, but nonetheless, the scientific method provided me focus on what it is that I was trying to accomplish. And so I really didn't become emotionally despondent when people would say and do things that were non-constructive in response to the questions that I asked. And in recording the answers, I noticed how it is that people on different continents of the planet gave the same answers. And that was very interesting to me. I've been to Namibia. That's in the southwest part of Africa. And asked people there the same question. And sure enough, I got some similar and some same exact answers. And have them all recorded to this day. It's a strange thing to have to come across that kind of information in that manner. But when you think about it, logically, a white person is a white person wherever they are on the planet. And so while that was the initial experiment that I ran, I also learned about a lot of different other things in terms of how people relate to each other on a day-to-day basis. And perhaps one day I'll be able to publish what I call my lab book of all the experiments that I've run and all the data that was collected, maybe sometime in the future. Hopefully that will inspire other people to do similar things. Did I answer your question?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Why did you want to write this book called How to Support and Defend the United States Constitution?
Out of necessity. People need it. People need the information. They need to be able to understand the concept and understand the practice of using the weight of the system of racism, white supremacy against itself. And that's basically what the book is about. The United States Constitution is basically just a tool to be able to use the weight of the system against itself. But there are many tools that you can use in order to accomplish the same thing. In fact, in the 4th chapter of the book, one of the 4 practical applications, I go through the process of using counter-racism jiu-jitsu without ever mentioning the United States Constitution. And so I said initially I wasn't going to say anything about that to see how long it would take for somebody to mention that to me. But I have no idea how long I'm going to have on this planet. I have no idea if anyone's reading the book all the way through. And so I thought I'd mention some of the tidbits of information about the book. But that is the main reason, which is out of necessity. Many things are done out of necessity. Many things are invented out of necessity. And so that's the reason, the main reason, because people need it.
In your book, How to Support and Defend the United States Constitution, it says, once I got over the initial trauma of realizing that most of what I had been taught was incorrect, which didn't take very long, I decided to set out to find out what is true. What do you mean when you say initial trauma?
Well, I think a lot of non-white people have the understanding, which is correct, I might add, that the white people who practice racism, white supremacy, use as their primary weapon deceit. And you may hear non-white people say this. You may hear white people say this. But even I was saying it without giving it very much thought. But that deception goes deep. I mean, it cuts deep. What I mean by that is they were using deception before you were born. And so you were born into a world. I was born into a world. All non-white people are born into a world where we really don't know what's happening. And so that is traumatic if you ever come to terms with it. For a person to come to the realization that everything that they thought to be true may not be. And many non-white people will not allow themselves to come to that realization. And so there's a certain trauma that's attached to that. And what happened as a result of that was that I had to set out and try to figure out how things work. I used to catch a lot of flack from other non-white people who knew about counter-racism longer than I did. Because I would always ask how. I mean, there was a couple of non-white people who actually called me the Indian a couple of times. because that was my focus, to figure out how things work. How is this put together? How do you take it apart? And because of the logic of the entire situation, although I asked myself, why are things the way that they are, I didn't stick with that too long. And I figured out that if I was going to be able to take this system apart and put a compensatory system in its place, I was going to have to be focused more on how than I was on why. And so that's the reason for me, at least.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very good questions.
Thank you.
Context of white supremacy. On page 35 of your book, you already touched on the scientific construction of the global system of white supremacy. And you write, you began to notice the practice of racism, white supremacy, is carried out in a very scientific and logical manner. I began to notice how structured the system of racism, white supremacy is, and that there are patterns of thought, speech, and action that are used by people who classify themselves as white, and that these patterns of thought, speech, and action are systematic, meaning that they are acted out in a collection or system of areas of people activity. You go on to say, I found that I was part of their experiments. Writing and running counter-racism science experiments helped me to understand the dynamics of how the system of racism, white supremacy, is put together, how it is maintained, how it expands, and how it is refined, and also how I participate in helping the white people who practice racism, white supremacy, keep me under their control. I found that a lot of the things I was doing at that time that I thought were working against the white people who practice racism, white supremacy, were actually working to help them. Can you elaborate on that the last two sentences, the things that you were doing that you thought were working against racism that were actually helping to maintain the system?
Oh, sure. One of the things is the use of words. For example, I would speak out about racism, and I would use the terminology that I was given to use. Integration, segregation. And I actually thought that by getting away from segregation and moving toward integration, that would somehow eliminate people being mistreated on the basis of color. Now, when I examine the words, I actually believe this, as many non-white people do, who attempt to make sense of how this system works using the language that we've been given. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Segregation, what do you mean by that? and how segregated is segregated. I mean, we are walking around on a ball that's spinning. And ain't too many people getting away from it. So what do you mean by segregated? Once I began to examine the words that were being used, I knew that all the work that I thought that I was doing in trying to get rid of the system was actually helping the system to function. Integration. I mean, what do you mean by that? How integrated is integrated? I mean, you had slaves on the slave plantation. Some of them in the plantation house with the slave master, cooking for the slave master, moving things around for the slave master, building for the slave master. Some of them in bed with the slave master. How much more integrated can you get? But the slave was still a slave. So once I began to experiment with words and changing the use of words, I began to understand how it is that the behavior of non-white people, even though we are passionate about eliminating the system of racism, white supremacy, because of the way that we use words, we are actually helping the system to continue to function. My guy once told me, he said, now, you know, this is what happens when we were having the same conversation. He said, this is what happens when you have good people doing things dysfunctionally. They do it good. So I began to change, begin to change the words and the way that I began to use words. And that's when I began to also notice how easy it is to take the system apart. Not just how it's put together, but how simple it is just to take it apart. Many non-white people are just not, I mean, we have been conditioned to hold on to those words and the way that we use words. I mean, we have developed an affection for it, not infection, an affection. I mean, we have been taught to use your own words, something that doesn't make any sense at all. A word is a word is a word. There's no way it could ever be yours. And so I began to examine a lot of things, many things, things that were taught to me, things that I had observed, to test, to see if what I thought to be true was true. And I tell you, that scientific method is an interesting thing. When you go to try to figure out, as you're thinking through the process of what the result will be, many times for me, the result wasn't what I thought it would be. And so I would change my thinking, not change the experiment so that it would coincide with the way that I felt about what I was doing. But I would begin to change my thinking about cause and effect. So if I do this, I get this. And then that resulted, of course, in me being able to understand, have an understanding of what it is that I was looking at.
Context of white supremacy. You offer your own views on how the system of white supremacy is put together, and you also offer suggestions on how non-white people can counter racism, white supremacy on the job. You talk about how one of the main ways that non-white people help to maintain white supremacy is by staying in conflict with one another. And you're talking about a situation on the job of how you use counter racism to keep the focus on white people. I'm just going to read this really quick and hopefully you respond. One day, our manager called me to the office and asked me what I thought about this as a non-white employee. Our manager, a white person, suspected racist. Our manager stated that she received, this is the non-white person, received many complaints. The manager received many complaints about the non-white female and wanted to know what my assessment was of her. I sat for about 10 seconds in an upright position, not slouching, looking her right in the eyes as she spoke to me, waiting for her to finish. Once she finished, I kept looking her in her eyes and asked her one question. What problem are we trying to solve? She looked at me for what seemed to be 2 or 3 minutes and began to ask me the status of a few projects I had at the time. I gave her the status and she thanked me and I left the office. That's how counter-racist code works. Can you talk about how counter-racism is supposed to keep non-white people from being in conflict with one another and to stay focused on white people?
Yeah, that was one example. The question that I asked is what I termed for myself as 7 to ground, 7-word question that grounds the entire conversation in producing justice. What problem are we trying to solve? That's one of the ways that on the job, I mean, there are many ways in all different areas of people activity, not just labor, but all different areas of people activity, where the white people who practice racism, white supremacy, keep non-white people focused on each other. I mean, you'll probably notice if you're watching a television program and they'll have 2 non-white people, one white person, that's the interviewer, 2 non-white people, and as you watch that interview, you'll see the white person saying less and less the more the non-white people are at each other's throats. I noticed this quite a bit in some of the early experiments as well. The idea is to not necessarily keep the focus on white people, but keep the focus on producing justice and make sure that white people are given the opportunity to make that happen. I mean, that should be the focus. And so with that in mind, my behavior became different. I mean, there was a time in my life, in my early 20s, where I would have just read the Lady the Riot Act about all the things a non-white female had done. I mean, her behavior on the job was completely unprofessional. But I wasn't going to tell her that. because that's the way that they play non-white people against each other. I mean, we have a very uncodified term for it. We call it divide and conquer. But what that really means is to keep non-white people focused on and in conflict with each other. I mean, that term divide and conquer doesn't talk about how anything is done. It's just a cliche term. Non-white people love cliche terms. And so, with an understanding of that, I began to say things different and do things differently. And that's one example where instead of me talking about the non-white female, then later on, the manager calling her in the office and saying, well, we received a lot of complaints from Mr. Williams and other people. See how that goes? Now you've got the non-white people focused on each other. So then she comes back to me and says something, and I say something, and then the white people who started the mess in the first place have to jump in and separate us.
And maybe you both get fired.
Exactly. But hey, that's how we play it out on a daily basis. Not only on the job, in church or the temple or the synagogue, in the grocery store. I mean, you hear about things on a daily basis. But in my understanding of counter-racism, I wasn't angry at her for the way that she behaves. I mean, this lady actually swung at me one time. I was sitting in my office, you know. If I didn't have some pretty good bob and weave, man, I would have got clocked. So, wow. I mean, and I don't know what was making her so angry and frustrated. But I didn't talk to her. I stayed away from her. And so understanding what I do about how the system works and how to take it apart, I understood that, you know, she's qualified to say those things and do those things because of the situation that she's in. You know, and if she ever needs help, I'm going to help her because that's one of the things I'm supposed to be doing while I'm on this planet. But until then, I'm staying away from her. Because she got a bad right cross, so.
I think that's minimize conflict, minimize contact, minimize conflict. I think that's code.
Oh yes, sir. And it works. Yeah, it works. Yeah.
Wow. Do you think your white supervisor would have requested your input if the employee in question had been a white person?
Oh, I'm not sure, but if the employee had been a white person, I would have done the same thing. See, the goal objective is to put the focus on producing justice. You know, I'm not going to sit here and gossip with you about this person at all. I mean, what are you even asking me that question for? These are the things I'm thinking. You know what I mean? You don't need my help to fire her. You didn't need my help to hire her. You know, so why are you even asking me questions about somebody else's behavior? It doesn't make sense unless the objective is to cause conflict. Then it makes super sense.
Your workplace strategies and This is one I feel like Mr. Williams has a lot of very helpful information. I have directed some folks to him who had questions about racist activity on the job. And I mean, it is evidence of the fantastic job that racist man and racist woman have done, that it is 2011 and black people still don't really have a counter racism workplace code. I feel like every black person has had a problem on the job. If you know a black person who has had problems on the job, man, let me know who that is. But we have no sort of counter-racist workplace code. And I feel like your book offers that. You have suggestions on non-white people and why they should ask for training. Just reading this from the book, this is page 90. You said, I requested to be trained on everything I was asked to do. And when I was asked why I needed the training, I responded by saying, in order to do my job correctly. As time went on, I accepted more roles and more responsibilities. When I requested to get my roles and responsibilities written, I was always put off. Can you speak to the importance of non-white people requesting training and requesting their roles and responsibilities to be written down?
Oh, sure. I mean, the training, of course, is the cliche term is telling, training, and testing. I'm not sure if Mr. Fuller is going to talk about that in his upcoming book. But the idea is that they'll tell you to do something, and then they'll test you on it to see if you can do it, rarely, if ever, providing you training. Now, if they do provide you training, it'll be weeks or months or years before you're ever able to put that training to good use. And by the time that they test you on it, you've still forgotten it. And so I kind of figured this out just by observing things, just watching how people do. Initially, I would, go to my manager in my early years and ask, well, why am I not going to training for this? And this person is going to training. Asking a question, sure enough, but not doing so in a manner that provided me with the desired result. And I began to notice that more and more and more. I said, wait a minute. These things are connected. Me receiving the training that I'm supposed to receive and me being graded on my performance appraisal, these two things are connected. And so I began to run experiments. And that's the best way that I found to phrase it in order to do my job correctly. So that if I don't receive the training, and most likely I won't receive it, when it comes time for me to get my performance appraisal, which is the assessment for my work thus far that year, which results in how much of a raise I will get, how much of a promotion I will get, I found that I was being shorted. I wasn't getting training, and I wasn't getting a good assessment. I said, well, that ain't right. It's the language that I used at the time. That's just not right. So I began to run experiments and try to figure out how it was that I was going to get beyond this. How was I going to get the result that I needed to get? And so that's when I started using the words in order to do my job correctly. And many times I still didn't get the training that I should have gotten. And when it came time for performance appraisal time, came time for that, I was being graded on doing something incorrectly. And I said, well, wait a minute now. I asked for training for this in order to do my job correctly. And I was turned down. Now, you don't provide me the training I need, and then you grade my performance against receiving the training that you had the ability to provide. You know, that's not due process unless I've been misinformed. And so that's when I started to pull into the constitutional aspect of it. After hearing that recording that I've included in the book that's on the website of Mr. Fuller and Bill Reeves explain out how to do it. I never done it like that, like it's explained on that audio. Because once you understand the logic, then you'll be able to put together the words that are necessary in order to get the job done. But you have to have an understanding of the logic first. One of the first things I try to explain to people. But many times we are under duress and we're stressed out as a result of things that happen on the job. And so people just don't have the energy or the time to devote to understanding counter-racism jiu-jitsu right then. And so that's part of the reason why I wrote the book the way that I wrote it. It kind of reads like a novel, but it's jam-packed with experiments, with practical applications, with explanations about how the logic works, so on and so forth. So that the person will take the time and use the energy necessary to understand it prior to having to use it. It's not one of those books like the code book where you can use this part and not use that part. You can't do that with this book because each part of the book complements all the other parts. So that's in reference to the training aspect. What was the other part of your question, sir?
With regards to why non-white people should seek to get their roles and responsibilities written down.
Oh yes, because number one, I mean the most immediate glaring aspect of that is that, well, you have to know what it is that you're performing to. I mean, many times on the job nowadays, people will just tell you, well, your roles and responsibilities is whatever it is that I tell you to do. And many non-white people will accept that. I mean, we'll get behind closed doors and talk about it and whatnot, how it's not right and whatnot. So not accept it from that regard, but in terms of doing something about it, you know, we accept that. But that ties directly as well to how you are graded, how your performance is graded on the job. How can somebody grade your performance on the job and you don't even know what you're performing to? You know, it just doesn't make sense unless it is their intention not to grade you favorably. Then it makes super sense. I mean, every position on a job exists prior to people being hired into it. It exists. And it exists with certain roles and responsibilities. Salary grade, educational preferences, so on and so forth. Because they have to know how to hire somebody to fit the bill. But as soon as you're hired, they won't give you that. I mean, that's one of the first things that they should give you. I mean, there's no way for you to be able to know how it is that you are performing to and or exceeding expectations. No way for you to manage expectations unless you know what those expectations are. And so once I figured that out, then, hey, that was the first thing I would ask for on a job. Have to know what that is. I have to know what it is that I was hired to do. I have to know my realm of performance so that I'll be able to exceed that and receive all of my raises and promotions on time. So that's one of the critical aspects for non-white people. Get that information.
Context, white supremacy. Before I hit the phone lines, I want to double check to see if Justice, if you have any more questions you would like to ask Ms. Williams, please go right ahead.
In your book, it says you'll never, hold on, I gotta go, I'll pull it up, okay. In your book, it says you'll never understand what you're looking at unless you know the truth about what's happening. Why will you never understand what you're looking at unless you know the truth about what's happening?
Because you won't know the context in which it's occurring and how it is that that relates to everything else. Let's take, for example, the example that I gave earlier about integration and segregation. I mean, you'll fight your whole life for integration. Integration of what? In order to do what? You'll fight to have children bused from school to school. Let's get the white children and the black children together, and they'll be integrated. Well, what are they supposed to do after they get together? No one is asking those questions. Let's just get everybody together. Slaves on the slave plantation, as I said before, were together with the slave master. It doesn't mean anything in terms of being mistreated on the basis of color. You can be together with a whole bunch of people and still be mistreated on the basis of color.
Mhm.
Right, you see, you understand what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Yeah. So the objective is to understand what you're looking at, and in order to do that, you need to have the truth about what's happening. I mean, what do you mean when you say integration? First question you ask, what do you mean when you say segregation? Analyze these things in your mind, write them down, test them out. Once you understand, it's going to come to you. That's just the way the universe works. When you raise a question, you draw the answer to you. You're not drawing to it. It comes to you. It's going to come to you. You question it enough, it'll come right to you. And you'll say, well, integration and segregation was never the problem in the first place, and it was never meant to solve any problem. It only produces problems by keeping non-white people confused.
You say in your book, many of the counter-racism science experiments that you ran involved white people, starting with the question, are you a white person? Why is that?
Well, when I came up with it at the time, it was because in a system of racism, white supremacy, of course, that's the most critical question you can ask. So that became the first question, especially if there were going to be white people involved in the experiments. Now, I said before that I discovered that I was a part of the experiments of the smartest, most powerful white people. So even if I'm not talking directly to a white person, the white people who practice racism, white supremacy, are indirectly involved, simply because I'm in the system of racism, white supremacy. Everything that goes on in a prison system, the warden is either directly or indirectly involved. That's just the way the system works. And so that provided me a clarity so that I wouldn't be confused, which is what non-white people should never be when they leave a conversation, either with a white person or a non-white person. Should never leave that conversation confused. And so what that grew into, as I looked over a lot of the experiments in the lab book, was that many of the experiments started with that one question. And I thought to myself, you know what, even if I gave a white person this lab book and let them study it, if I started with that one question, there's still no way that they would ever know what experiment I was running. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but at the time I thought to myself, now that's interesting.
What if I am in France and I ask a person if they were a white person, and they say, no, I'm not, and I see how they function, and their skin color is really pale. Do you still suspect that they're white?
No, would you still suspect that they're white? Would you?
Yes.
Why?
Because
there are no wrong answers. Just take your time and tell me why.
I don't know. I still have to think of I still have to think of that.
That's the best answer you could have gave, if you have to think about it. That's an excellent answer. So sometime in the future, when we have another conversation, I'll bring that up, and hopefully you've had time to think about it, and then you can let me know. Is that a deal?
Yes.
Excellent. Have any more questions for me?
Yes. In your book, you say, what I found out, in a nutshell, from that particular science experiment was that wherever a white person goes on the planet, they are still a white person. How did you conclude that?
Because wherever I went on the planet, which, of course, I didn't cover the entire planet. I mean, there's no way any one person could ever do that in a lifetime. But wherever I did go on the planet, where I ran the experiment, I got similar answers, and a lot of times the same answer from people who I suspected were white. This makes super sense in terms of what it means to be a white person in a system of white supremacy. So there are no white Americans. Now, there's such a thing as an African American, whatever that means. But a white person could be that. See, once non-white people start to think globally and universally, really, I mean, that's the goal objective, to think as a universal person, to speak as a universal person, and to do things as such. Then they'll begin to take an overall strategic position about how things work. And so when you look at the planet and how things work, all over the planet, white people are white people. I mean, they may call themselves by different names, and I suspect that they do that just to keep us confused, because when they're with each other, they're white people. And all over the planet, non-white people are non-white people. And there are many more non-white people than white people. And so there are many more categories to keep us focused on and in conflict with each other. And there's no way a smaller number of people, numerically smaller number, can control a numerically larger number of people, except by keeping them focused on and in conflict with each other. See, so the white person doesn't have to do all the killing directly.
I found the answer to the question that you asked.
Oh, okay.
Because they might be racist.
I'm ready. What's the answer? Are you ready? Oh, what was your answer again?
Because they might be racist.
Oh, that's an excellent answer. That's an excellent answer, Justice. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome. You say in your book that the first counter-racism science experiment you ran was asking people if they were white, and you recorded their response. Why did you record their response?
Oh, that's part of the scientific method. See, I found out that just asking a person if they're a white person, I mean, what does that really mean? What does that really mean? I mean, I have to be doing that for a reason. And I had an older white male who just sat back and looked at me, and he said, "What is it that you're trying to find out?" You see what I mean? And what I was really trying to find out was the very same answer to the question that you gave, the question that I gave you, the answer that you gave me. Whether or not that person, I should suspect that that person is a racist. And I told him that. And he said, "Yep, I'm a white person." And I thanked him for the answer. So really the only reason to run that experiment at all, see, when you ask a white person, "Are you a racist white supremacist?" They almost, see what I mean? They almost have an allergic reaction to that. It's like, oh, it's always about race. It ain't no conspiracy, But when you ask them, "Are you a white person?" Now that they'll give you an answer to. And their ego is plugged into that answer.
If you have offspring, how do you help your offspring learn and understand racism, white supremacy?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, I have a son and a daughter, actually. Me and my daughter used to watch television. This is just one example. We did lots of things together, and I would take her through the logic of how things work. One of the things we used to watch television together. She used to love to watch cartoons on Saturday morning, right? Love cartoons. So there was this one cartoon in particular, and I guess she was about 7 or 8 at the time, I guess. One cartoon, I can't remember the name of it, but it was about this guy who always walked around with a karate suit on. I can't remember the name of that cartoon. But he was supposed to be a karate person. And the cartoon was about him and his daily life, doing things from day to day. And I would ask my daughter,
Samurai Jack?
That's it. How did you remember that? That's the name of it, Samurai Jack. And so we were watching this cartoon one Saturday morning. Woo! We were watching that. And so I asked my daughter if she wanted to go to the museum. That was one of her favorite places. There's this museum in Houston, which tells you all about the inner workings of the body. I mean, you actually walk into rooms that are made like different parts of the body. And she loved that stuff. I didn't know why at the time, but now I know. She's in college to be a doctor, so now I understand why it is she loved that stuff. But I asked her if she wanted to go to the museum. She said yes. I said, okay, I need you to do something for me. Take a look at that cartoon right there and tell me what's interesting about that guy. And so she looked at it. And I went into the kitchen, cleaning up after we had eaten breakfast. And she came back and she said, his hair is black. I said, no, that's not it. Go back, take another look. And so she came back and said, I don't know, Daddy. What is it? I said, if you'll please take another look, I'd appreciate it. Take another look and think about what it is that you're looking at. Samurai Jack. And And she went back and started looking at the cartoon. See, now while she's looking at it, she's observing how it is that he relates to other people. She's observing his mannerisms, how he looks, what he does, what he says. And she came back in to the kitchen, and she looked at me and said, "His skin is yellow, Daddy." I said, "Why do you say that?" She said, "Well, you can see it." And sure enough, that was it. See, Samurai Jack didn't talk like a quote-unquote Asian. His eyes weren't slanted like a quote-unquote Asian. His eyes were round, but his skin was yellow. So we had a very interesting conversation about that on the way to the museum.
So his skin was yellow, but he was functioning like a white person?
Yes. That's the deception. I noticed that I don't think that cartoon comes on anymore. But that was years ago. I mean, that was like 10 years ago. But that's just one small example of the things that we used to do, things that we used to talk about together, as I helped her to explore how the world works among people and helped her prepare in terms of what to do about it.
My dad talked to me about my 6 friends. What are my 6 friends, and how did you come up with my 6 friends as a title of your book, or your book? Sorry.
The other books that I'm writing. My Little Friends is the title of it's a series of children's books. My Little Friends, which the little friends are words: who, what, when, where, why, and how. And each book is a story in a child's life and the things that they learn throughout their day, focused on one of those words. There's a why book that focuses on the logic of why, a how book that focuses on the logic of how, and so on and so forth. The reason I decided to write these books was because what I noticed in black children especially is that we come to the world, all children do, they come to the world extremely inquisitive. They want to know how everything works. They want to know why it works that way. They ask question after question after question. And as they get older, they don't ask so many questions. It becomes fewer and fewer questions. I talked to one of my nephews recently. He was talking about his son had come to him, telling him about how he feels ashamed in class when he needs to ask a question. I said, you see, he's already learning how not to ask questions. So something happens to us during our life where we stop asking questions and just accept whatever's in front of us. And so part of counter-racism ideology is to get us to ask more questions. Ask and answer as many questions as possible. in an effort to understand what we're looking at, in an effort to understand how to do things constructive, in an effort to understand what it takes to replace the system of racism, white supremacy, with a system of justice. And so I thought it a good idea, I hope it's a good idea, to write children's books. And there's no age limit on these books. There's no age requirement. But these are not books that you can put in front of a child and just tell them to go and read it. These are books that the parent and the child have to participate in the reading process together. And so, because I found out in my early years that, well, I didn't really care much for writing, but my father took a big interest in me writing. And I didn't really care about it at the time. But what I found out later in life was that it was his interest in what he saw that I was capable of doing that fired it up in me later on in life. And so it's nothing better than learning from your parents. You don't get no better than that. Your parents teaching you things that are constructive, don't get no better than that. And so hopefully, when I finish these books, people will read them with their children and keep that fire, that inquisitive, wanting to learn passion that children come to this planet with. They'll keep that. They'll be able to keep that going for the rest of their lives. Don't you ever lose it, Justice. Don't ever lose it.
I just wanted to say before I go on to my last question, thank you for, it was fun having you on the, it was fun talking with you.
I've had lots of fun talking with you too.
Have any of your offspring ever shown interest in dating white people?
Yes. Yes, my son dated a white girl for about 2 days. I thought that was interesting. It took him that long to figure out exactly the things that I have told him all of his childhood years were actually true. Woo! He told me it took him 2 days to figure that out.
What had you told him all of his childhood years?
Well, it's going to take longer than 15 minutes.
Give us the 5-minute version, maybe.
I wish I could. I mean, I basically explained to him how the system works. You know, and it was early on. It was very crass. You know, because I didn't have the language that I had later on in his life to explain it to him. So early on, it was basically a lot of the same things that, when I say early on, I mean, when he's 3 and 4 and 5 years old, things like that. It was basically the same language that a lot of other non-white people are telling their children. You got to get an education, you got to do this because of this, but I really didn't have the language pinned down. But as he got older, and he was 17 at the time, he dated a white girl. During that time, I had some of the language seen in it. You know, even though at that time I didn't know very much about counter-racism, I had some of the language seen in it, some of the same language I use today. And so he understood to a great degree how things work among people on this planet. And so he reluctantly gave me some details, which I can't go into right now. But he said it was an eye opener for him. Those are his exact words. It was an eye opener. And then he made a huge mistake. He grabbed a hold of the next black woman he could find and married her. I say that was a huge mistake because, oh man, they argued and argued and argued. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to be with someone or to want to marry someone who you argue that much with and that loud with, and that is not, constructive at all. And so he should have waited as much as he could and tried to figure things out, tried to figure some things out. I guess he took after me. I was married to his mother when I was 19, and so he probably took after me in that regard. He wanted to get married early, but I wish he'd waited. But now he's with a woman who he says is the love of his life, black female, beautiful girl. And he says he's happy. She says she's happy. What more could you ask for?
Glad you came on the cows. What specific constructive information have you shared that you hope will help non-white people replace white supremacy with justice?
I hope that I have offered, in some regard, ideas, strategies, and techniques that the white people who practice racism, white supremacy use to keep non-white people abused and subjugated and to misuse and mistreat non-white people on the basis of color. And I also hope that I have shared in some regard my experiences and some of the strategies and techniques that I've used and that I've observed other people using, of how to, in a constructive manner, understand what you're looking at and use that information to replace the system of racism, white supremacy with a system of justice as quickly as you possibly can.
I don't have any more questions. Thank you for being a guest for today's program, and I hope we can have you on again for a guest.
I look forward to it. I've had lots of fun. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes.
Groovy. I'm going to hit the phone lines to see if we have questions. I've been on my job. I'm sorry?
I said, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. I was able to be on my job during the broadcast. I have attached an episode of Samurai Jack to the description, so you can watch an episode and you can see, what Samurai Jack looks like. But it's right in the description. If you refresh your page, if you're listening, you can see it. And we have like 6 minutes left in the live stream, so you can call in. It'd be a good time to dial. If you did dial in, you should probably put your hand up if you think you have a question. The call-in number is 347-215-6071. And Mr. Williams' book, again, you can download it. Click the title, How to Support and Defend the United States Constitution for Victims of Racism, White Supremacy. Just click the title. It's right here in the description. If you are listening someplace other than Blog Talk Radio, come to the show page for the cows. This specific episode, it aired on Friday, January the 28th, 2011. Find that episode, and you can just click the title for the book and download it. Person who called in, last 4 digits. You called in from a block number. Person who called from a block number, your line is open.
Okay, greetings and good evening. I would like to first ask the guest. Greetings and good evening to everyone. The first question I would like to ask is to the guest is there a lot of deep, in-depth empirical and scientific research by conscious scientists, researchers, professors, and scholars that show that the system of racism and white supremacy exists? The second question that I have is, in thinking logically and scientifically, have you observed any flaws and or limitations in the thinking, mentality, and actions of white people? If so, how can non-white people practically use this to their advantage? And lastly, you speak of thinking globally and universally. I understand that all non-white people are dominated by the system of racism and white supremacy. But would it be correct to say that all non-white people think the same and see the world the same? In other words, would it be correct to say that all non-white people have the same universal perspectives and frames of reference? That's it.
Okay, I'm not sure if I can remember all those questions, but I'll take the last one first. If you can find some research, some empirical evidence, some scientific experiments that can prove that all non-white people think the same, I'd like to take a look at that. I'm not sure how it is that someone could answer that question. Personally, I don't know all non-white people. So think the same in reference to what? I'm not sure how it is that I could answer that question. The first question was whether or not there is some research by professors and some scientific evidence, so on and so forth. I'm paraphrasing, as to the existence of racism and white supremacy. I think you said racism, not racism, white supremacy. Everyone that I have ever met, I can speak from that perspective, and many of them are college professors and people who work in what's termed the media, in the entertainment area of people activity. Pastors of churches, synagogues, temples, both genders, male and female, multiple continents on the planet. Scientific research even that refers to race not being biological in nature. so on and so forth. There's lots of evidence out there if you're looking for evidence of whether or not the system of racism, white supremacy exists.
It's a pleasure to hear your voice, Mr. Williams, and I do enjoy it when you call in on the Gus Show and you have those very thought-provoking questions.
If the people that called in could allow him to finish his response, I wasn't opening the lines up for people to talk. I just wanted you all to know that they were open, so you can keep the noise down. Thank you. Sorry about that, Mr. Williams.
Not a problem. Thank you, sir.
I appreciate you making the book available. I did went ahead and I did download it, so I have it saved in my PDF files. But what I was going to ask you, you mentioned...
I thought I was being clear in saying I wanted him to finish getting an opportunity to answer questions. I was opening lines up just in case my switchboard goes out, but since that's not working, I'll just go down the line. My apologies, Mr. Williams. If you could continue with your answer, that would be great.
Yes, sir. No problem at all. Those things are going to happen in this system. If the point of your question is to compile evidence to prove to someone else that the system of racism, white supremacy exists, I'm not sure how it is that you would go about doing that. There's lots of information published in books, magazines, newspapers, on the internet, all over the place, worldwide, that I suppose you could use in that regard. But for me, I simply say that the system of racism, white supremacy does exist, and I'm a victim of it. So once I've made that statement to myself, there's no need for me to search for additional information in books, in magazines, newspapers, talk to additional people, and attempt to convince myself even further that it exists, because once I make that statement to myself, that statement is a result of my observation and experimentation from me being on the planet as long as I have been. So I don't look to other people to try to convince me of that. I make that determination on my own. Now, I apologize, sir, because I don't remember what your second question was. But if you'll ask it again, I'll be sure to try to address it.
The second question is, in thinking logically and scientifically, have you observed any flaws and or limitations in the thinking, mentality, and actions of white people? If so, how can non-white people practically use this information to their advantage?
Oh, yeah, okay. Great question. Yeah, there is one of the basic ones is in terms of how words are used. I mean, that is a double-edged sword, and the white people who practice racism, white supremacy, know it's a double-edged sword. They know that that is their strength, and also it is their weakness. What they're betting on is that non-white people will not come to the realization and the understanding of how words work in the minds of people and what to do with that information. That is what they are betting on. And so far, they are winning the bet. You know, if you talk about non-white people worldwide, because they know exactly what to say to pit us against each other. And they know exactly what to do to get us to kill each other. And there's loads of evidence worldwide. You know, if you're just looking for some evidence to that regard. but their strength and their weakness is built around the same thing, how words are used. And so non-white people becoming aware of how to use words and using the use of words to produce justice is the beginning of the end of racism, white supremacy, and they know that. So the result of that will be, once a substantial number of non-white people become aware through whatever means necessary to use words in such a manner that they provide clarity, reveal truth toward the production of justice, that what's really happening is the non-white person begins to think differently because we use words to think with. The non-white person begins to speak differently. And the non-white person begins to act differently. And one of the things that I have in the book is in reference to using counter-racism jiu-jitsu is you'll see a reaction that's totally reverse in many cases, where instead of the non-white person jumping up and down, screaming and shouting, waving their fists, saying this, saying that, cussing and going on, the non-white person will be poised and in control of their own behavior, speaking in a monotone voice such as this, saying their words very carefully, thinking about what they say very carefully, projecting themselves in such a manner that they are serious about being serious. The exact opposite will happen to the white people that they are talking to. They will become the person who's jumping up and down, screaming and shouting, pounding their fists on the table, things of that nature. And it's almost like a role reversal. Of course, that's not the reaction that you're looking for. The reaction that you should be looking for is the production of justice. But it's important to mention so that you won't be taken aback and taken by surprise when you see it happening. You'll know exactly what you're looking at. And then you'll know exactly what to do in response to it. I hope I've answered your question, sir.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to bring the next person on that had a question. Mr. Williams, we're over the 2-hour mark. I want to be courteous with your time. If you have to go, it's no worries. If you are able to stay, that's great too, because some other people did call in, but it's up to you, sir.
Oh, yes, sir. I have time. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Thank you for
yeah, thank you. Thank you for your time. Non-Mighty Wick, your line is open, sir. Did you have a question?
Yes, sir. Thank you for taking my call. Thank you, Mr. Williams, for coming on the program today and making time to share your views. I appreciate it very much. I've always enjoyed and learned a lot watching your videos or catching recordings that you've done previous to now, and including this one. In regards to a previous recording I've heard with you on it, I believe, if I'm correct, you made a statement saying
we're not hearing you, not Mighty Wick.
I'm sorry.
Not hearing you. I'm not sure what happened to. Yeah, we're not hearing you. If you can get your mic issue corrected and ask your question, that would be good. Your mic is still open, so I guess. Oh, and I just lost my switchboard. I was going to click to get the next caller on, and switchboard crashed. Mr. Nero, I did get your line open. Mr. Nero, did you have a question?
Greetings. May I be heard?
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, Gus. Right now I'm driving. Does it sound? Is there a lot of distortion or background noise?
No, you're good.
Okay. Greetings, Gus and Justice. Mr. Williams, sir, it's been a pleasure listening to the interview. I, too, have learned quite a bit from your website, and I've also, I think your site was the first site I purchased some of Neely Fuller Jr.'s interviews off of, if my memory serves me correctly. I do have a question. My question, sir, is how did your family respond to you identifying with the system of racism, white supremacy? That'd be my first question. And then my second question, sir, would be, do you have any white people that have married into your biological family?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. I mentioned before, gave some small aspects of how I was raised and things that we were taught at a very young age. So although many of the members of my family, and I use the word family very loosely, while they do agree that the system of racism, white supremacy exists, they are reluctant to talk about it in many regards. But I attribute that to